Let me now introduce the good and gracious Barbara Bentley, Professor Emeritus of Ecology at the State University of New York, SUNY Stony Brook. While on faculty, she was also Dean of the Graduate School. She earned her MA from UCLA, her PhD in Ecology from the University of Kansas. Her other accomplishments include, but aren't limited to, Vice President and Board Member for Education for the Organization for Tropical Studies, VP of the Ecological Society of America, Director of the Board of the Community Health Plan of Suffolk County, Long Island, appointee to the Environmental Conservation Board for the Village of Head of Harbor, New York, consultant to the Brookhaven National Laboratory, National Science Foundation Visiting Professor, Fulbright Fellow, member of the Board of Directors of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and last but not least, a page at the children's area at the Arcadia Library when she was a kid, and her mother was a middle school librarian. So we are very delighted to have Barbara here today, and I will take a seat. She will start her presentation, and for those of you on Zoom, you'll see the slides progressing. For those of you here, you have the paper to follow along, and if anyone gets confused, just chat or raise your hands. We'll do a brief poll at the end before we do questions and answers, and then we'll tie it up hopefully around 7. Okay. Barbara.
Well, thank you so much. This is going to be a very interesting experience. I do have a live audience, which is wonderful. And I know you're there too, okay? This is a report of the research that I did looking at the effects of global change on plant-herbivore interactions. And of course, herbivores eat plants. And so plants have things to keep herbivores from eating them. But first, what is global change? Well, it is increased carbon dioxide, and we all know this. And this is the big problem. It's also methane, and both of them have the same effect, which is to capture heat and keep it from re-radiating back out into the universe, and so that it gets warmer and stays longer, faster. And it is primarily due to human activities. It is automobiles, fossil fuels, and all the different ways that we use them, and cow farts. Actually, this is a major source of pollution in the Midwest because the cows fart a lot, and it's methane, and that can have an effect on global change just as carbon dioxide can. And if you look at your little handout, you will see the changes in carbon dioxide through the years, and of course, the font is so small, I can't remember what the beginning date is, but you can see that it stayed very low, and then following the red line, this went zooming up, and it's not stopping. So that we're increasing carbon dioxide at least the same rate, if not an increased rate. And so that you can see in the right hand of that, the actual levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's measured in parts per million. Which may sound like it's just tiny, but it has a very major effect. So it is something that is there. It's something that we know where it comes from. We do kind of know what we should do, but we're not real good at addressing that. My interest in this is the cascading effects, so that if you have carbon dioxide, as you will hear as I'm talking through this influences photosynthetic rates. Photosynthetic rates influences growth rates of plants. Growth rates of plants increase the chemistry within the plant. Growth rates of plants also is impacting on the other herbivores that we know and love, like cows. So what's happening is that it's cascading effects. And what it's doing is it's increasing the temperature, so that you can see in the first graphs there where it says global warming climate changes. Those are the average daily temperatures over the years. And so they are increasing. And what this means is that in the next little slide there is sea level rises. And the reason why this is happening is because glaciers are melting. And so that Antarctica primarily and glaciers are literally increasing the level of the ocean. And what that means is that you have increased severity of storms, as we've all been reading about just this last week, that is happening, and it's true. And this is cause and effect. It's also leading to ocean acidification because when CO2 dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. And so that this can have an effect when the pH becomes more acidic, it can have an effect on lots and lots of different organisms, especially animals with shells, because the shells are made of calcium carbonate and they dissolve in an acid. And so that this is having an effect on the oysters and the clams and a lot of those animals, that their shells are getting weaker. However, my real interest is in photosynthesis, and that little tiny formula there. And I was very hesitant to put these, complex chemical formulas in, but I figured, you know what, I will use the words. And on one side, it's carbon dioxide and water. Following the arrows, in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll, will create sugar and oxygen. And so the oxygen that we have here in our atmosphere is because of it's because of photosynthesis. So that's where it is. And as you increase carbon dioxide, you increase photosynthetic rates. And that's what I was interested in. What does this do to the plant? And I was looking at lupins. So you all know lupins, I hope. Bluebonnets of Texas and that sort of stuff. The one that I have on a lot of these images is Lupinus arboreus, which is the species I actually worked with. And it's a shrub that's this tall, and it's woody, and it grows in coastal environments in sort of central California. So I did this work. There I was, a terrestrial botanist working at Bodega Marine Lab. And the interesting thing to me is that these are nitrogen fixing plants. They use the photosynthate that they produce from photosynthesis to run the bacteria in the nodules of the plant. And unfortunately, there's a very awesome picture that people online are going to see. In the root system of the legumes of lupins, there are nodules, they're sort of lumpy looking bumps on the roots, and they're kind of pink. And the reason why they're pink is because that's hemoglobin. It's a variation of the hemoglobin molecule that we have, and it's used to transport oxygen. So it's carrying oxygen in to these bacteria so that they can fix nitrogen, because nitrogen fixation is a very energy consuming process. And so as you increase carbon dioxide, the plant has more photosynthate, more sugar, which it sends down to the nodules. The nodules then feed the bacteria. The bacteria thinks it's heaven, and they will just grow like mad and fix nitrogen, which is good because we add nitrogen to the soil all the time. And this is a form of nitrogen that plants can use. And so that it looks really, really good. And nitrogen is very important to life. As you'll see there, the two molecules I have there, I'm gonna put my glasses on. Amino acids and chlorophyll. And if you look at those and those tiny little writing, you can have to, other people are seeing this really well, but you will see they're both the chlorophyll and amino acids contain nitrogen. And those are critical compounds for life. Amino acids form proteins. Proteins are us. Proteins are life, basically. And chlorophyll obviously is involved in photosynthesis. So this increase in carbon dioxide increases the concentration in the atmosphere, which increases the photosynthetic rates, which increases then nitrogen fixation in the plants because it's there. And we all love plants that are nitrogen fixers. Farmers use alfalfa because they rotate alfalfa through because it's nitrogen fixing and adds nitrogen again to the soil. So we all think that's wonderful. However, what about lupins? It is a nitrogen fixing legume, and I'm so sorry that you don't have the slide that shows those nodules because they are just amazingly abundant and very, very active. It's a nitrogen fixing plant. I just told you that. And it contains alkaloids. So not only does it use the nitrogen for chlorophyll and for proteins, but it makes alkaloids. The alkaloids, alkaloids like caffeine and strychnine and things like this. This is lupinine, and it's a toxic compound. It tastes very bitter, so it's poisonous to small insects. And so that what happens is the lupin makes the lupinine, the alkaloid, to be able to protect itself against the herbivores. And this is especially, and mostly insect herbivores. And so there they are, being eaten because they're much more nutritious. So the insects think this is really wonderful. So the plant makes more alkaloids to keep the insects from feeding on the plant. And so this is what I was looking at is what are these cascading effects and how do they interact? And so in the research that I was doing, basically there were three areas of questions. Does increased atmospheric CO2 have any effect on nitrogen fixation? So that we all know that if they changed photosynthesis. And so that part of my research was to look at nitrogen fixation rates and nitrogen content of the plants. If so, what effects does this nitrogen have on the nitrogen distribution in the plant? So does it change the proteins? Does it change the chlorophyll? And does it change the alkaloids? The answer is yes. But then we have to ask, how would these changes affect the herbivores feeding on the plant? And that's really where I was focusing. So, excuse me, most field biologists use observation rather than experimental design for studying in a scientific process, but I really like experiments. And so that I had set it up as an experimental design. And I grew Lupinus arboreus, this lovely lupin right here, in the phytotron at Duke University. And the phytotron is an amazing facility because it's not really even greenhouses, it's growth chambers where they can control the light, both intensity of the light, seasonality of the light, they control the humidity, they control the temperature so that I could go in and say, okay, I want to have conditions like Bodega Bay for the temperature and humidity and day length. Yes, let's make it, summer because that's when these plants grow. And so that I then planted the plants there at the phytotron. And phytotron, by the way, phyto means plant and tron means machine. So it's a plant growing machine. And I did it with 3 levels of nutrient treatment. So I actually provided the plants with high nitrogen, low nitrogen, and then inoculated with, excuse me, Bradyrhizobium, which is the bacterium that actually fixes the nitrogen. So that the plants that were given the high nitrogen or low nitrogen, they were grown in sterile soil. So I could look at them just as plants without the bacteria. And then I had the plants with the bacteria. And then I had 3 levels of carbon dioxide concentrations at 350 parts per million. This is what it was. It isn't anymore. 500 parts per million and 650. And this was then looking out to, 15, 20, 30 years in advance. And we're doing a good job of keeping up with that, I'm afraid, which is not good news, but there we are. So if you look at the results, it did what it was supposed to do. Let me get my glasses. So if in the graph on the left, it says % nitrogen in the foliage, and you can see the green and the blue columns were the low nitrogen and high nitrogen, and then the red column is with the Bradyrhizobium. And you can see that nitrogen in the foliage is dramatically affected. It is dramatically important in the nitrogen for lupins. And that as you increase CO2, they actually have higher nitrogen fixation rates. They have higher nitrogen concentrations. The interesting thing to me is the difference between 500 and 650 is that it didn't go as high. And okay, I'll come to my analogy later. I have a cute analogy. But what this means is that the plants were responding very much to the nitrogen in the soil. And then if you look at the other graph to the right, there is the percent of alkaloids, and it shows the same pattern. That as CO2 increases, alkaloids increase because photosynthetic rates go up, nitrogen fixation rates go up, so alkaloid synthesis goes up. The interesting thing to me is that at the higher concentration, it goes down again. So that this is saying there's something, basically what happens is the plants, when they have all of this carbon dioxide, they just fix carbon like mad, make all of this sugar, and the sugar turns into starch, and they have starch granules, and they store the starch granules in the chloroplasts, in the green parts of the leaves. And they get so big and lumpy, they actually interfere with photosynthesis. So that it's not so good now. It was good, but it's not so good. Then what I did was to say, okay, let's look at the next part of this interaction, which is the effect on insects. And I used armyworms, Spodoptera. These are common lab insects that will feed on stuff. And they would feed on lupin foliage, which is, of course, important. A lot of organisms don't. And so then they were fed the foliage that was from the plants that had, first of all, were inoculated. And secondly, had the 350, 500, and 650 parts per million CO2. And you can see in the graph to the right there that the larvae weigh less. So what happens is as alkaloids increase, even though the quality of the food is greater, the alkaloids inhibit their feeding. So that it's this mixed bag. Now, just to give these were the experiments that I did, but let me just tell you briefly about some of the other studies that had been done. Okay, pasture grasses do not fix nitrogen because they're grasses, they don't have nodules, all of that sort of stuff. Elevated CO2 does change photosynthetic rates in grasses because obviously grasses are photosynthetic. However, they have more carbon without more nitrogen. So the grass actually becomes poorer quality food because we like to look at high protein food for our animals. And so this is lower quality foliage. It means that the cows have to eat more grass to gain the same amount of weight. And so what this does is to lead to lower yields for the farmer because they have to use more of their pasture to feed the cows to get the meat to be able to sell it. So what I like to say is elevated CO2 is like chocolate cake. 300 parts per million is really good. And you should see the slide on this. I love this slide. It's really good. 500 is even better. But 650 is too much of a good thing. And the picture I have shows a child with holding a chocolate cake going, yeah, like this. So basically, ultimately, if we continue doing what we're doing of increasing CO2, elevated CO2 is not so great for herbivores. And that means, fine, that's not so great for armyworms, but important for us, it's not so great for the herbivores that provide us with a lot of our protein. So just remember chocolate cake. At first it's really good and it's still good even when you get more. And then after a while, you just cannot take it anymore. And that's the response that plants have to elevated CO2. Okay, so the future is our choice. And this is, the CO2 is there because of us. And I'm going to go ahead and say we, including all of us here. We all drove cars to get here, I expect. We all are looking to make sure the furnace is going to be working this winter. So we are contributing, but we can act on it. And this is why it's always so nice to talk to garden groups, because a climate-friendly gardener is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And there is a brochure which is, if can you show this, or oh, it's right there. Okay, right. This brochure is a climate-friendly garden, and it's a brochure that gives all of this information about what you can be doing. And I'll just outline them very quickly. Okay, minimize carbon emitting input. Okay, power tools. Yep, that's CO2 right there. Now, I am not recommending you go and use, hand clippers on the lawn, but on the other hand, sort of thinking about what it's doing and how frequently you're doing it, and whether in fact you really need to do it, is all part of the decision of using power tools. And artificial fertilizers are give off all sorts of gases, as well as feeding the plants. And feeding the plants, you get an increase in the growth rate, and then you get and then you get decomposition, and decomposition from more growth is more CO2. So again, it's one of these things, use it wisely rather than as they say on the boxes. And very importantly, don't leave the garden soil naked in the off season. Use cover crops, winter blankets. This, first of all, it's holding the carbon in whatever the cover crop is, but it's also inhibiting decomposition of the organic matter in the soil. You want to keep that organic matter in your soil anyway, and so that it's a win-win on that one. The other thing is plant woody vegetation, trees and shrubs, because the woody vegetation, the trunks are carbon sequestration, all of the woody parts. Produce homegrown veggies, and the main reason for this, well, there are two reasons you can see here. One, it reduces transportation emissions so that you're not burning gas to get a potato onto your stove. And it also produces better quality soil. And so people who are paying attention to grasses, to vegetable gardens, are paying attention to the quality of the soil as well. And expand recycling to include the garden. And this is something where everything that you can put to compost, I have worms, so I have composting worms, and I meant to bring them with me so you could have seen my worms. But I would say that 80% of the vegetable matter from my kitchen goes to the worms, and the worms chew it up, and it becomes this really, really organically rich soil, so that it, instead of tossing it out and then having it just decompose. And the other thing is landfills. This is a huge policy decision, but landfills, they're now getting better at monitoring what's going into landfills, but they have been just sort of plowed out there and put in. And then it's anaerobic, which means it's without oxygen in the soil. And so instead of producing carbon dioxide, it produces methane, and methane is even worse in terms of global change effects. So, keep it out of the landfill if you possibly can. And the final one here is think long and hard about your lawn. We Americans, we suburban Americans, take great pride in an over-fertilized garden and an over-fertilized lawn. And so that minimize the fertilizing, leave the clippings on the lawn. It adds mulch, and it decomposes and puts the nitrogen back into the soil rather than going out to the landfill. And mow it higher instead of having this doesn't count because it's it's different. But you want a lawn that's like 4 inches deep, unless you're really serious about tennis or something like this. So mow high for healthy roots. First of all, it's more biomass, so it's tying up the carbon dioxide there, but it's also shading the soil and increasing decomposition. And so sort of in summary then, it is the good, the bad, and the ugly, that CO2 is good. We've got to have it for photosynthesis. The bad is we got too much of it. And the ugly is that it's going to have a terrible effect on our environment unless we do something about it. And gardeners are right at the front line in this. So yes, please plant and plant and plant and plant woody vegetation too. Okay, so that's what I have to say. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
It's kind of interesting, we talked about armyworms, and as you're standing there, there's tent caterpillars, which are that family right behind you, as on the tree over there.
Oh,
Way in the back.
Way in the back, so they were part of your.
the frame, yes, yes, yes. Well, we want herbivores around. I mean, you know, they're even tent caterpillar.
You talked about how too much CO2 makes it more vacuous nutrient plant for animals, so therefore for us as well, right? For humans digestion as well. So the plants we're growing to eat in our garden,
Yes,
under high CO2 levels, are bulking up with a lot of less nutrient also.
that's true. That's true. Although because we're omnivores, we're not as concerned about the nitrogen content in our greenery as cows. I mean, cows eat exclusively grass. And so that's where the big problem is. And of course, as I said, it's the methane that catch those farts. Yeah. Okay.
Very interesting.
Other questions? Thank you. Welcome.
Sorry, I'm late. I was counting my money and copier money and pennies and.
First things first.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And are there any questions from those on the Zoom meeting? You can put them in your chat window. It's funny you mentioned the farts. Isn't somebody in Germany doing something where they're trying to capture? What's that? Didn't hear that the other day.
Yeah, they're creating feed that costs less.
Ah, okay, okay. So that makes less methane as the waste. Yeah.
They're working with plants that do that.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Mhm.
Well, yeah. We eating less meat also would help.
Oh, yeah.
I guess if you had a big roof over the entire pasture and then capture all the methane as a right something funnel.
We could do that. Yes.
I guess feedlots or barns could already maybe do it. I don't know, maybe.
I think the magnitude of all of this is so huge,
Yeah.
you know, and yeah, I mean, we can sort of think of all sorts of things, but really it's fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And we can surely do something about that as we all drove here. Me too, but yeah.
What are some resources for people who want to get accurate, I'll say, information about contributions to carbon and which things contribute most?
I would say the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, that they maintain a lot of data sources. And that's where a lot of these data came from. Yeah. By the way, data is a plural word.
Yeah. Well, even scientists use it both ways. It's like.
No, it drives me crazy.
So I probably missed all this, but what have you thought about, we talk about cattle, of course, large scale
Yeah.
operations. What about people that have like chickens and rabbits or a few little goats, something like that on their own properties? That could be any more efficient use.
It
of
depends on
resources?
what they do with the feces. If it's reintegrated back into the soil and is used as nitrogen, that's fine. The main reason why cows produce so much methane, it's not because of their digestion, it's because they have microorganisms that digest, and the microorganisms give off methane. So that it's if you have a digestive system like a cow, you can eat grass, but they have a very complicated digestive system because grass is not all that nutritious. And one of the things that they do is they have to get rid of all of that carbon to be able to get the nitrogen, because they need the nitrogen for their proteins.
Oh, I remember, they're potty training the cows. That's right, they were training like 12 or 14 cows. They got to go pee and poop in a particular place, so they could collect it, and they would get food as a reward. And they were able to train them to do it in a certain place. That's right.
Yeah, but that's the feces and the urine.
Right.
And this is cow farts. I mean, I use
Gotcha.
that term, but
Fair enough.
that's what it is. Yes, your farts too, by the way, just to let you know.
No, we don't do that.
Okay, I'm sorry. Here on Orcas, we don't fart. Okay.
We emit.
They're pure.
We
fart.
admit. Yes.
What were your studies entail when you were at the Marine Center in Bodega Bay?
Oh, this is the study I did there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that
But
that
then
I.
you had your plants at,
Oh,
on the other
okay,
side.
there's the field part of it, and then there was the experimental part. And so the field part, Bodega, the lab, it has land, and that's where this lupin grows. It's a native there, so that all of these pictures of this beautiful, beautiful plant. This is, I said Lupinus arboreus, and it's woody. So it's this big woody lupin with yellow flowers.
It also is very landing.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I was doing the field work, looking at what insects were feeding on it, and I would protect a plant from the insects and see how it would grow without the insects present. And those kinds of things I did in the field. And then the experimental stuff I did in the fire truck.
I just sailed by there the other weekend at Heights. I thought, man, what a cool place that would be to
It is.
work or go to school.
It is, yes. I had National Science Foundation funding, and so I worked there for about 18 months. Yeah, and at one point I was on sabbatical, and I spent half of my sabbatical in Western Australia because they grow lupins in Western Australia as a crop. And so that it's a crop, well, more information than you may want, but lupins have alkaloids in their foliage, and they also have alkaloids in their seeds. But because they're nitrogen fixers, their seeds have lots of protein in them. And so that these cultivars of lupins are very low in the alkaloids, and they're called sweet lupins because the seeds are edible. And so that they grow them there. And
Human consumption?
human consumption, but also as cattle feed. It basically enters the world like soybean. So as we use soybean, we can use the lupin as well. So, and this particular species of lupin grew there. And I had gone there previously. Well, I had gone there a lot of times. But thinking about lupins, I thought, well, that's a whole population of lupins. And so that I could do the experimental stuff there. And so the field part of the experiments. And yes, if you keep herbivores away, they grow big and happy. And if the herbivores are allowed to be there, they eat a lot less. And so, yeah.
I just learned yesterday about the bullock permaculture garden on Orcas Island.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yes, yes.
Deer Harbor, yeah, they do. They've done a lot of work in Central America also, but they have classes and they do like training, permaculture type training here.
And when they're doing permaculture, is it because of rotation or specific crops?
Specific crops, I don't know, I haven't taken the class, but what I understand is they talk about certain types of trees and things that you can do, almost like the forest garden type concept. So not like, you wouldn't lay out a bunch of crops like in rows, but it's basically picking different things that. Self-seeding perennials, things like that. They're focused, and I don't have to sort of ad living, but they have a website too. It's the
Yeah,
Lawrence
I'll have to look
Permaculture
deeper into
Institute, I
that.
think it's something like that.
Yeah, because
Yeah, there's new people.
I think those are the kinds of things, especially using nitrogen fixing plants as cultivar, as not just cultivars for food, but in gardens and stuff
Yeah.
are really useful. And all legumes fix nitrogen. And it's too bad you couldn't see that picture of the hemoglobin in it, because it's called leg hemoglobin because it's not human hemoglobin, but it's the same chemistry. And so it's carrying the oxygen into the bacteria in the nodules.
You can look at it on the computer if you want to after the session. It's pretty cool.
Yes.
And it's in the handout that shows the,
It's this little guy here.
oh, yeah. Almost like ganglia or something.
Well, but the little red
It's the little-
guys,
it's-
Yeah.
These are the nodules on the
Nodules,
roots.
yeah.
And see how that one is pink? That's because it has leg hemoglobin in it.
What is the word you're saying before you were going?
Leg, as in legume.
Oh.
So that, you know, they're just different molecules, but different forms of the same molecule. They're all hemoglobin because they're oxygen carrying atoms, no molecules.
so beans. You should grow beans. Like-
Beans, mhm. And make sure that you inoculate them.
Yes,
And-
what did you mean by inoculate?
Oh, okay, so if you've been growing legumes in an area for a long time and there are nodules on the roots, that the bacteria will survive in the soil. So the next year when you plant a legume, the bacteria will invade, which sounds awful, but you want them to. But we often have sterile soil, especially in agricultural lands. And so that you can get little packets of bacteria. I'm sure it's mixed in with, you know, organic matter of some kind, oatmeal, I guess. But, and so that what you do is when you plant the plant, you just put in some of the bacteria.
Mhm.
And the bacteria will do best when there are legumes around, but they do survive when legumes are not present. And so that's what inoculated means. It's not going in, you know.
So if I've been growing beans in my garden without inoculating them, they're going pretty well, does that mean I don't need to continue?
What I would suggest, if you are willing to do it, is dig up a plant and look at its roots. Because it should have nodules on it. And if it doesn't, the thing is, if it does, be happy and proud. But if it doesn't, you know, you can get inoculum at the nursery. So.
Is it sort of similar to mushroom compost and, you know, the mycelium running kind of that Paul Steinitz kind of stuff?
Yeah, they're very, very different organisms, but they're part of the soil ecosystem. And mycorrhizae are very important in allowing a root system to reach further into the soil to get to the nutrients. So the mycorrhizae will pick up the nutrients, carry them back to the roots, and then the roots will carry it to the plant. So that it's, so the mycorrhizae are not making nutrients. The nodules are synthesizing. And this is important actually, because what is it? 20% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, or is it 80?
I thought it was more than that. I thought it was 80.
I think it's 80 and then 20% is the oxygen. Yeah. You know, don't ask me to take my oral standing up. So nitrogen is here as N2, but it's not active. It's not a reactive molecule. And so that all this nitrogen out here, as much as the plants would love to have it, they can't get out, they can't use it. And so what the bacteria do is to change it from N2 into ammonium or nitrate. And it's the nitrate that actually, well, both of them plants can pick up. So, yeah, nitrogen is not limiting. It's the form of nitrogen that's limiting.
Compound.
Yeah.
Ammonia
Or nitrates. So, yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you guys. This has been fun.
Yeah.
And thanks to you folks too. Am I still with them?
You are. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, all of you online. And we did a little poll and I'll share the results. Everyone would recommend the program to a friend.
Okay.
And I only asked 2 questions. One is how'd you find out about it? And one, would you recommend it? And it looks like people found out about it on the website by word of mouth. So,
Not the newsletter?
and the community
Yeah.
calendar.
Yeah.
I actually didn't write the
Oh,
newsletter
yeah.
down as an option. I forgot that one, so we'll add that one next.
Yeah.
So Barbara, it was a pleasure to have you.
Oh,
Thank you very
It's
much.
I love doing this. Thank you so much.
Yay.
Yes,
Thanks
yes.
everyone for
Especially
coming.
from my own community. So thank you.
And now we'll stop Zoom and everybody go.
Okay. Bye, people.